All right, folks, I want to welcome our guest to the show. It is Seth Breedlove, the man behind Small Town Monsters. Welcome to the show, Seth.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Absolutely, man. It was great to get to meet you up in the Smoky Mountains. I had a blast at that conference a couple of weeks ago. I actually was talking to RPG last night, and we were kind of reminiscing about him emceeing the conference, and I thought it was a really, really good time. And obviously, you had your entourage there. It was nice to see the Small Town Monsters crew right around the corner. What did you guys think about the conference? Did you have a good time?
Yeah, that's one of those ones I've been hearing about it for the last couple of years, and then you see the videos and stuff, and it always looked like it was pretty crazy. Here in Ohio, we've got the Ohio Bigfoot Conference, which was for the longest time like considered the granddaddy of the conferences, like the big cheese. But honestly, the crowd at the Smoky Mountain one kind of blew it out of the water, blew OBC out of the water. So that was kind of surprising. We had a blast though. I mean, we were there. That was kind of a new experience for us. We don't do many events. We do maybe 5 events in a year that aren't something that we're putting on. And so that was a kind of a we wanted to try it out and see how it was, and I think we all agreed we'd like to go back and do it again. Plus, like I grew up going to Gatlinburg like 2-3 times a year because my parents traveled a lot when I was a kid. And we've been in that town in every season. We got snowed in once there for over a week back in January of like 1997, and it's one of my favorite memories of being a kid because the place was a ghost town. We were like the only people out walking the streets and stuff. It was pretty cool. But yeah, we loved the event. It was good. I wish I could have heard some of the speakers, but I can't remember the last time I had the chance to sit and listen to like a speaker at one of these conferences.
Yeah, that was my first time being there as an actual vendor, and I felt the same way. I didn't get to hear. I've had Meldrum on the show, of course, and some of the other folks that were there on the show, but it's a lot different seeing them in person and being in the moment when that room is full and they're going through their thing. And I did walk through a couple of times on the way to the bathroom, and I got to hear some of the things that Jeff Meldrum was talking about, and obviously RPG introducing folks, and it was just a really, really cool conference. I'll definitely be going back next year for sure.
Yeah, we'll be heading back if everything goes to plan.
Well, let's get into this Bigfoot paranormal thing, right? I always ask this to folks that come on. What got you interested in the paranormal in general, but Bigfoot specifically? What prompted that interest in you when you got started down this path?
Yeah, I mean, um, so I grew up in a really small town in Ohio called Bolivar, which is like a pit stop off of Highway 77. And it's at the very northern tip of what they call the Sasquatch Triangle here in Ohio. But I didn't know about that until way later. I mean, I was in my maybe my late teens, early 20s before I even became aware of like what Bigfoot or UFOs were. Like UFOs, I was introduced to through the Mothman Prophecies movie, the the Richard Gere film. That's the movie that introduced me to the idea that there were people that thought they were seeing ghosts and UFOs. I didn't know that was a thing. Um, and if I did know it was a thing, I probably associated every single aspect of it with like demonic something, right? Um, so yeah, it was way later in life till I got started getting interested in that stuff, and it was mostly through boredom. I was working like a lot of medical billing jobs. I was working a medical billing job, and then I was working as a freelance reporter for some local newspapers and doing film reviews and covering like political rallies and stuff like that. And yeah, through boredom, I got pulled into the Bigfoot topic through podcasts that I was listening to. And in 2014, I launched my own podcast. It was called Sasquatch, and then that led into our first movie, which was Minerva Monster. And then I started driving around back roads down in Bolivar because there was it's a weird story, but a friend of a friend told me about again, it's convoluted. A friend of a friend told me about his dentist who had ongoing interaction with what they claimed was like a Sasquatch family that lived on their property outside of Bolivar. And I wouldn't have thought anything of it other than the person must be crazy, if not for the fact that they were someone who I'd had interaction with, and I thought that they were a very believable witness. Her husband was the DA, the district attorney, and he was one of the people who was talking about seeing these things. Their kids, who I eventually spoke to, all claimed that this was real. So either, like, I still don't know what to think of the story because it's so out there. Like they literally claimed that they could follow these things on horseback, back to where they were living. And so it's the wildest story I think I've been told, in that it came from witnesses who seem believable. And so that was like the first thing that I really looked into. I started driving around the roads down there during the day and the night, during day and night. And I would talk to locals, which was kind of like where my freelance reporter stuff came into play. I knew how to connect with people, I guess. And plus I'd grown up there. So it was I used to ride my bike around those roads when I was a kid. It was formerly strip mined land, really interesting area. These days it's been actually pretty heavily developed, even in the last 5 years. If you watch the first, it depends on which version of it you watch, but if you watch On the Trail of Bigfoot, as an episodic series, like it was on the DVD and the Blu-ray, in episode 1, we're actually, like, we go to the location. If you watch the movie, On the Trail of Bigfoot, the legend, it's like the bookend for the first part of that movie, the first chapter of that movie. So really interesting, and that's what kicked it off for me. I was also, like, while I was doing that, I was starting to put together a pitch for a book called Small Town Monsters, that would be kind of like a case book of rural monster cases around the United States. And I had sent that out to a bunch of publishers like Anomalist and all the typical paranormal. My parents had connections at like Simon and Schuster and stuff like that. So I was sending the pitch to everybody, and everybody pretty much rejected it. So we just when I ran into these two guys the next year that had film equipment, and they were interested in trying to make a documentary, and I was like, I think I have the subject, and it was Minerva Monster. That was a story that I had already done a lot of preliminary research on. I'd made contact with like the family that had claimed interaction with the Minerva Monster back in 1978, and so that was what we did. We took the gear that they had, and we went and made Minerva Monster for like $500 back in 2014. And then I used all the connections I had in Ohio media, which at that time were pretty substantial, to kind of like trumpet the movie. And I mean, I had the newspapers I was writing for were like doing cover stories on it and stuff. And we were able to really drum up a lot of interest in the film. And then we released it in May of 2015, and it made enough money. These days, I don't know what it would have done. I have a feeling it would have done fairly well. We did not have a streaming platform we could have put it on in 2015. Things have changed that quickly technologically. Like, a filmmaker didn't have many options even in 2015 as to what we could do. But we put it out just on DVD and Blu-ray and sold it ourselves through a couple websites. And then 2 years later, or a year and a half later, I was able to get it on Amazon. And once that happened, like once Amazon opened to filmmakers, then that kind of changed the game for us. We were able to take what we made on that movie and flip it into the next movie, and then flip that into the next movie, and just start the ball rolling from there. But it does crack me up, dude, because every time we do an event, because you mentioned the Smoky Mountain thing, every time I do an event, someone will come up to me, somebody who wants to be a filmmaker, is a filmmaker, and they say something to the effect of, I want to do what you're doing. And it's so hard to explain. I think the only guy I speak to, there's two guys that I have talked to about this who get it from their end. One is Stacy Brown, because Stacy's kind of doing his own thing. And the other's Alexander Pedikov, who works with me now. But Stacy and I have talked about this before, but like you gotta, I mean, it's like you're rolling around in the mud for years, and when you're trying to get this thing going. So whenever someone tells me they want to do what I'm doing or whatever, I'm like, well, you better be prepared to just toil at it for years before it pays off. Whenever like a filmmaker or anyone asks me for advice, that's the only piece of advice I have to give is like stick with it, because it's not going to come overnight. Doesn't matter how good the product you put out is, how good the film is, how much the communities love it. They will not be enough to make it a success. It's all about just sticking with it and finding your own way through it as well. I'm really babbling. I'm sorry. I haven't done a podcast in a while, man. I did 2 shows of my own, but we've been so busy with like the move, and then we're putting out 4 movies a year right now and running all the other stuff. I can't remember the last time I talked on a mic to somebody.
Well, I'm glad it's with me, man. I was grateful to run into you at the conference. You've been on my short list for quite a while to get on the show. And because you're so busy, it's not easy to do. So I had to just say, hey, I want to get you on the show, and here you are. And that's one of the things, like you were talking about, with the successfulness of Small Town Monsters and what Stacy's doing with Outcast Paranormal. When I had him on the show, we kind of talked about that off the air a little bit, about just the consistency it takes and the just go-getiveness it takes to get into something when you're a content producer.
Mm-hmm.
It's really tough to do. And that's one of the things that I talked to RPG about last night was, this new film they've got, the Skunk Ape Experiments, that they just released. It's something different. It's very, very different than other documentaries, but I have watched, I think, just about everything that you've put out. And I was watching one of the shows last night, and it was a Bigfoot show. It was the Bigfoot on the trail of Bigfoot the Legend, I believe is the name of it. They all sort of run together when I'm watching them all for doing the research for the show. Mm-hmm. But just the way that you have been able, in my opinion, to capture what's going on in the moment in those films is very unique to me, Mm-hmm. And it's one of those things that I connected with when I watched some of the documentaries. Is you start to connect with the people, obviously. And getting to see you and your crew at the conference, it's clear that it is a team effort. It's a family group that you guys have created. And right. I think that translates, at least for me, that translates through what I see on the television screen when you put these films out. When you did this Small Town Monsters thing and you started doing these films, did you have it in your mind that you were just going to travel around and do some of the bigger known things, or did you have sort of a plan of attack or a plan of action to tackle things that you were interested in, or how did that come about?
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, there's kind of 2 answers to that. There was no plan. Like there's not a plan right now. Like you part of that is because you don't know what's going to hit and what isn't. And so like some of the stuff that I wanted to do, like On the Trail of UFOs, we're not going to do anymore because it's not, it doesn't hit with an audience. The first season of On the Trail of UFOs as an episodic series is one of the most watched things we've ever done. We had a blast making it. In fact, we were just talking a couple of weeks ago about how much fun we had making On the Trail of UFOs season 1. But when it came time to start finding distribution for it, because Amazon shut down everything to like shut down the open platform to creators right after that. Then it became about, okay, well, maybe we can turn this into films. So we made 2 films, and the first movie actually did really well, Dark Sky. But Night Visitors came out and floundered. Part of that was my fault. I probably didn't put anywhere near enough effort into promoting it, because I was focusing on like 3 different things when it came out. So part of it was just the promotion end of it, and then the other part was like the distributor kind of flopped it when it came out. It did not come out in a fashion that was going to benefit it in any way. So we had to pivot, and now we're finding other things to do. But as far as like cases and stories I wanted to cover, there was a wish list. I mean, definitely, like we wanted to do, the first 2 we made were 2 that I really loved. Minerva and Whitehall, especially Whitehall. And I mean, Minerva, I've actually weirdly grown further away from as time has gone on. Not the town or that area. Obviously, I do a series called the Bigfoot Project for our YouTube channel, where I go out to Minerva and that surrounding area, and we're still doing that. By the way, I've like it's been at least a month and a half since I put an episode out, but we're that's another thing. Like we're changing that into a seasonal format. So we're going to film a bunch of episodes over the next like 2 months, and then they'll come out 8 episodes at a time. But there were those two, and then Mothman was always one where I was desperate to make that movie. And Mothman was interesting because it was the one where like Brandon Dalo, who does the film, the music for our films. He's been with me since Minerva, so he's the only remaining member of the STM crew from Minerva, other than Matt Harris, who still does illustrations for some of our stuff. But Brandon and I had talked for at least 2 years leading up to making Mothman at Point Pleasant about making that movie. And what happened was Boggy Creek Monster was going to be the game changer for us. We thought that was going to be the movie where it would, like we'd be on the world stage or something. And I remember thinking like we were going to get a distribution deal for like television and all that. And that would be the big one. And then it came out and it kind of flopped. Like, I don't know. Most people don't realize that that's like the movie we made that really, like, in terms of what we put into it financially, it's never quite done enough for me to feel like it was worth it. Cause like we killed ourselves making that movie. So when it came time to make Mothman, it was an all or nothing kind of scenario. The Kickstarter that year did well enough. I think it made over 20 or right around 20,000. And so that was huge to us at that time. If that happened now, we'd go under the next day. But like back then that was massive. So we put everything, all the chips were down when we made Mothman at Point Pleasant. And that movie came out and did, it's weird because on the trail of Bigfoot, the Discovery is actually now the biggest thing we've released, like in terms of like what it makes coming out and how many people see it. Discovery is the biggest thing, but we'll never recapture the excitement around Mothman Point Pleasant because we undersold it. For one thing, we underpriced it. It would have probably made double the money, but I priced it at like 99 cents or something idiotic. Maybe that's why it did so well. I don't know. All I know is like we put it out on a Thursday night at midnight. We were in Pennsylvania filming Invasion on Chestnut Ridge when it came out. So it drops midnight. We're in Pennsylvania the next morning and we start looking at the bestseller lists on Amazon because we're like, all right, it's exciting. And it opened, like literally came out, and it was in the top like 10 in horror immediately. And we're like, well, that's wild. And so you're checking the lists throughout the day, and you can tell it's charting really well. And I got on the next morning so that was Friday morning. On Saturday morning, we got on. We were getting ready to shoot an interview with Eric Altman for the Invasion on Chestnut Ridge, and we pulled up Amazon, and we were the number like 12 or 13 best-selling title on the platform. So it was charting above like major Hollywood releases, like huge. And by the end of the week, and by the end of the time that we were filming down there, and we're filming every chance we get, we're going back and checking the lists. We were charting higher than Logan, and Logan had just come out. And so that was wild. And then we started like by the midway through the next week, we were charting. We were in like an up and down battle with Rogue One. And it was the wildest, just, and it stayed steady. It was a bestseller on that platform for months, for like 2.5 months. When we put it out free on Prime, it was like a flood of activity. But that was what changed the game, the movie did so well, and then we could focus on this full time. But that was the big movie where that was the one I wanted to make, I had to make. And I think it shows. Like, I don't think that's our best movie. And when people ask me if, like, what my favorite movie is, it's never Mothman at Point Pleasant. But there are things about that movie that I know that we really heavily invested ourselves in. And the creativity in that one is such a step up from like Boggy Creek Monster or what had come before, Beast of Whitehall. And you know, there's little things I love about that movie too. Like we have, I think during the bridge clap sequence, um, I think it's It Is Well With My Soul. It's either It Is Well With My Soul or Amazing Grace plays. It's a really great version of the song that Brandon did. And little things like that kind of like echo who I am as a person. I dig anytime we can get that stuff into one of the movies. So that was like, and then from there, it was a lot of stuff. Invasion was something where I had gotten into these topics, listening to Eric Altman and Sean Forker talk about Stan Gordon's work on Beyond the Edge Radio. And so when we made Invasion, it was for me, it was like trying to pay homage to those guys for getting me into all this insanity. And then, you know, there's been other projects that we really wanted to do. Flatwoods was one I always wanted to do. Flatwoods is one of my favorite movies that we made. You know, but I mean, we're in the midst of finishing up Jersey Devil right now. I mean, it'll be done in the next like 6 days. And that was like kind of the last one that's on the list. So now it's like we're just finding the topics that we want to do, and it's actually getting more difficult. Like next year, right now we're in a position where I'm not actually sure we're going to make a Legend movie. Like we refer to that line like the Minerva, Whitehall, Boggy, Mothman and Point Pleasant, Flatwoods, Skinwalker, Howl of the Ruger. We refer to that line as like the Legend line. And that's what kickstarted our entire production company. But right now I'm in a position where I'm like, I don't know that there's anything out there right now that I really want to go like focus my energy on. There's other topics I'm interested in. So we've got 2 on the trail of Bigfoot movies coming out next year, which we haven't announced. And then we've got a top secret project that we're going to start shooting here in October in Texas. And then there's going to be something else. And I'm trying to decide what the something else is. Honestly, what I'd love to do right now is make American Werewolves 2, because I loved making American Werewolves 1. And I really want to take that out to the Southwest, like go out to the Southwest desert and make something out there. So we might do that, but we're definitely like, we're not running out of topics at all. It's just the cases, the stories I want to make those types of films about aren't as prevalent right now for me. There's a lot of stories I would have loved to have been able to tackle that we can't because witnesses are gone, or you know, you can't get enough people involved. I will say I prefer making anything that involves witnesses over investigators. The more I'm in this, there's so much drama and politics amongst the various investigators and researchers. And I'm not trying to bag on anybody, but it gets exhausting. Like it's by far the most exhausting part of making these movies. Whereas when you're talking to just witnesses, it tends to be a totally different process. A lot of the time they have no interest in being on camera. So you're not dealing with like ego necessarily. So that's why I loved making American Werewolves. It was like, just shine the light on the witnesses, let them talk, no narrator, just, you know, let them do their thing.
Yeah, I watched that just last week, and it was one of my favorites because of that very reason. It was so refreshing just to see people being able to share their story like that. Very similar to what we do on the podcast here and some of the other podcasts that do encounter stories. But I too, like you, I'd rather talk to people who've had encounters, but you know, it is the business of people want to hear that mixture of having people on that are in the game and the investigators and things like that. But I definitely prefer talking to the witnesses. I'm glad you brought up the American Werewolves, and I hope there is going to be a 2.
Yeah, I mean, it's done so well. It's not like through the roof or anything, but with that movie, there's something about these the projects that focus on the witnesses that they cost a heck of a lot less than the projects that don't. And just in terms of like travel time and how we shoot them and like how it's organized and everything. When we shot American Werewolves, it was literally like we had a house and witnesses would come to us and we'd sit them down and we would talk to them. And that was like, there isn't the insanity of like the Alaska, like on the trail of Bigfoot trip, where you're like frantically flying from place to place, and then you're on a helicopter with the doors off flying around. I mean, I love the adventure filmmaking side of this, but it's very costly. And so stuff like American Werewolves. The other thing that I love about American Werewolves is, I don't know how to say this right, because I guarantee no matter what I say, it's going to sound wrong. But the creativity end of that movie it all came in the edit, and we had a look we were going for, but like yeah, it's hard to say because it sounds like I'm trying to toot my own horn, which isn't the case. It's just like the entire movie was kind of like, it was originally just, the only thing we knew is we wanted this like 4:3 aspect ratio, and I was watching Twin Peaks at the time, and so I was like, I kept saying, oh, I was inspired by Twin Peaks, but it wasn't until I got into the edit and I had a pretty well done cut of the movie. The movie's pretty well set in stone. I woke up one night, I could not sleep because the movie was really bothering me. I thought it was boring, honestly. It had the witnesses were great, their stories were great, but there was like nothing going on. It could have been a podcast, and would have worked just as well as a podcast. And so I woke up one night and I was like, I couldn't sleep, and I got my iPad out and I grabbed YouTube, and for some reason one of the recommends was that old 90s TV show Sightings. It's like late 80s, early 90s Sightings. And I put it on, and I watched that a lot when I was making Invasion on Chestnut Ridge, but Invasion has a very, very set kind of like unsolved mysteries tone. It's taking itself very seriously. Even though it's like silly and it's like it's definitely trying to throw back to the 80s, it takes itself seriously. And I'm watching Sightings, and I was like, the interesting thing is the one I was watching, it had nothing to do with anything. It was like a UFO or vampires, maybe. It was one or the other. But the witnesses were coming across as like really like open and honest, and their stories were scary, but the visuals were corny as all get out. And I actually really appreciated that dichotomy. And I was like, I'd be interested to see if I could do that, like make that work. And then I got up. That was like 4 a.m. I got up and went out to the other room, and I started doing all the double exposures. And by the end of that day, American Werewolves was starting to look the way the final cut looked. If you saw it right before that, it wouldn't even be recognizable as the same movie. But I started doing all the little like 80s things, and I took the synth music and I added the synths, and then it all started coming together. But I love that creative end of, and I don't, this is the kind of stuff your audience probably has no interest in at all. But like that creative stuff is the stuff that gets my goat. Like that's what excites me about doing this. Like we're making this Jersey Devil movie, and it's especially different from American Werewolves. Like we're talking about witnesses. Jersey Devil, there's not a single witness, and there's only 6 interviews. Actually, I don't even know if it's that many. It might be 5. And it's all historians and folklorists just kind of walking you through these 3 very specific time periods in the Jersey Devil history. And in between each of those time periods are these little like vignettes. They're basically supposed to be like short films that look as if they were shot in the time period that you're about to witness. So it starts with, and we go backwards. So we start in the 80s, and then you go into the 1909 stuff. And we had a whole film, normal, like talky, everyone's talking to each other, and like very like kind of like Hammer horror inspired, but a little hokey. And it wasn't working, and it was driving me crazy because I was like, the Ranger sequence, the 80 sequence is working, and then the sequence that everyone is familiar with, the birth legend, the birth of the Jersey Devil legend, that sequence is one of the best things we've ever made. The actress Megan, I forgot her last name, Megan, unbelievable. Like the acting in it is insane. Like it's by far the best thing we've made in terms of like a narrative. And it's this little like 11-minute sequence that ends the movie. But then there's this sequence in the middle that's about these outlaws that get chased to this house by a posse, and they hole up in the house, and eventually they get attacked by the Jersey Devil. And it was driving me crazy because it wasn't working. It was clear it wasn't working. And I woke up one night and I was like, I wonder if I could take it and turn it into a silent film, because it's 1909. And so I got up. This is at like 3 o'clock in the morning. I got up and I went into the other room and I sat down and I wrote all their dialogue into Premiere, into titles. And I started sticking them next to those little sequences where they're talking and running it, like running them side by side. And by 8 o'clock in the morning, I had run an export. It was like 11 minutes long, and it was really rough. I mean, but it was a silent film. So we took this whole movie we had already edited and shot and everything, but I turned it into a silent film, and I sent it to everybody on the crew. And I was like, am I crazy or does this work? And everyone was like, no, this is great. This works. And so then we started we overhauled that whole sequence, and now it's a silent film. So the middle like vignette in Jersey Devil is our first silent film, and it has a really cool vibe. I was working on it today actually. And that's the kind of I love that end of this, like the filmmaking stuff.
Yeah, I'm the same way. I do a lot in post-production on the show, and it's sort of therapeutic for me to sit down and do the editing and make the product that you have that much better.
Mm-hmm.
I want to get into some of the Bigfoot stuff. Let's talk a little bit about some of my favorite stuff that I've watched on television. And I certainly want to talk about the Bigfoot project as well. Let's talk a little bit about the time that you got to spend with the guys at the Olympic Project.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the things that I've enjoyed the most about doing some of the research on over the last couple of years. I had Shane Corson on the show last year, and we talked about those nests. I've always wanted to go see them, right? And I've only got to see them because you took me there. So let's talk a little bit about that experience. And what was your opinion, and what was your first reaction when you got to see the nest site?
Well, we got to go to the Olympic Peninsula back in 2018 for the first time. And Shane, this is my favorite story about probably making an SDM project, because it was so insane. Mark Matsky and I flew into Washington, into Kennewick, Washington in 2018. We had 4 days to film an entire episode of On the Trail of Bigfoot with the Olympic Project that was also going to involve a side trip to Mount St. Helens with Mark Marcel. And so we got off a plane at like noon, and by 4 o'clock in the afternoon, we were following Mark Marcel at Mount St. Helens. I mean, it was an insane 24 hours. The next day, we woke up and drove all the way up to the Olympic Peninsula, and I met Derek and Shane for the first time. Within 2 hours of meeting them, Shane marched me up a mountain way too quickly, apparently. And I got horrific altitude sickness. I knew we got back to our hotel that night, and I knew something was off. I was like, I could just tell, I was exhausted and I couldn't breathe. And then the longer the night went on, then I started throwing up, and then I couldn't stop throwing up, and I threw up for 6 straight hours, and I could not breathe. And it ended up completely scuttling our entire plan for what we were going to do. Thankfully, we had enough footage with Shane and Derek that we were still able to get some really good interviews with them, and then even some good B-roll out of the trip. But it ruined what we were really looking forward to, which was seeing the coast and really getting around the Olympic Peninsula. And so a couple of years passed, and I had been in touch with Shane on and off about the nest because it fascinated me too. And so I knew I was going to make a movie about it. I just didn't know how that was all going to come into play. But yeah, it's one of those things where you hear them talk about how difficult it is. That was the biggest thing for me in making that movie, was being able to put an audience in that place, show an audience what it was like going in there, traveling in there, and then hiking through that undergrowth down into the nest site. And that's one thing I'm really proud of with that project, is we were able to show the kind of crap that those guys have to wade through to get down into that nest site. They're some of my favorite people. Like when I talk about the drama of investigators, I'm not talking about those guys. Like I've never had any. It's funny too because of anyone who could probably give us a bunch of crap, or create drama, it would be those guys because they're in the thick of things. But I've never dealt with anything from those dudes that I would consider drama, and they were so open about everything. Like, yeah, that whole process was the filming there was some of the most grueling. That was one of the most grueling shoots I've ever been on. But it was my time with them are some of my favorite memories of filmmaking. There was one night in particular where it was me and David Ellis and Derek, and I don't know how this happened, but it was just us three at the HQ, and they had Elton John blasting on a speaker overhead, and the three of us are sitting there. My mom's been battling cancer since 2020, and the three of us we're all kind of like, obviously they're the big dogs, and they've dealt with that kind of stuff in their lives, both of them. And so the three of us were talking about our moms, and it was like those are my favorite moments, when it comes to filmmaking. But to get to spend time with those guys in that capacity is so much more rewarding than just seeing their Bigfoot evidence or whatever, But I mean, I get it. Like they're legit. Like they're the guys that you want to hear that stuff from. But they're also like just some of the kindest people I've had the chance to work with or be around when it comes to filmmaking. And they're, in my opinion, they're probably the nicest group of Bigfoot folk there is. My perception, I can tell you my perception of the nest site, just in full transparent honesty, my perception of the nest site the first time we walked in there was like, so what? Like it just didn't. But my perception of it changed too. So the longer we were in there and the more time you have to think about it, and we all talked about this, my whole crew talked about this when we left, and because we all kind of had that reaction to it, we're all kind of like, oh, whatever. And then the more time we're spending in there, the crazier it kind of became, because that undergrowth in there is so thick, dude. I mean, you can't it's like you're bushwhacking your way down in there, and then all of a sudden it's just like cleared out. I mean, there's just in that entire nest site, it's been cleared out, and it's been years since they found those nests, and it's still clear. It's coming back in, but it's like compared to the forest around it, it's totally different. Whenever people, obviously we get everyone telling us, this is squirrels. I guess that was that was one of the big things that we kept hearing was, oh, you guys found squirrel nests and you're all excited about that. We heard squirrels. We heard like military guys were like running testing in there, which whatever, like maybe, I guess. Doesn't make a lot of sense, but the squirrels thing kills me. Any natural animal that people throw at us is like, you just found like bear nest. Like this is a bear nest. Squirrels, bear nests, birds. I heard birds. Yeah, I think I had a sighting a year later. I would honestly still place the Olympic project and my experiences in NAWAC at area with the NAWAC at Area X over my own sighting. Like I don't, in terms of like how much it changed my opinion, or moved me one way or the other.
Yeah, I definitely want to get into your sighting as well, but I feel the same way. I've got to meet a ton of people from doing this show over the last couple of years, people that I've looked up to in the Bigfoot world for quite a long time. And very few people honestly have disappointed me, but David Ellis, Shane Corson, Matt Pruitt is another guy,
That's awesome.
it just people that I consider friends now and Mark Marcel. Oh my God. Mark Marcel is probably one of the nicest people that I've ever had the pleasure of dealing with on and off the show.
Mm-hmm.
Super incredible dude.
Have you hung out with him?
I have not.
It's like,
I've not.
He's like, so he's huge First of all, he's like, he towers over you, so he's kind of intimidating. Like, he is a big man, but he's like a giant teddy bear. Like, he's one of my favorite people. All this, I don't have a negative thing to say about a single person in that group. I mean, there's it's funny, all the drama I deal with comes from the East Coast. It's like, so maybe it's just something about the lifestyle on the West Coast. I don't know, but Matt is a good guy too. He's in the NAWAC as well. So yeah.
So you mentioned it already. This is an encounter show. We really haven't talked about many of those. Will you share your experience and what you experienced during your encounter?
Yeah, we were okay. So, like, full transparency, my sighting's boring. The exciting thing to me about that time, that weekend, was what happened the night before, which is in the episode of the Bigfoot Project. But that we kind of caught, a little bit of what we were experiencing, but there were aspects of that night that weren't really picked up on the cameras. But that night, so okay, so let me, I guess, set the stage. We were my researcher at Small Town Monsters and producer Heather Mosier, she lives on a large chunk of family property outside of Minerva, like 400-ish acres, somewhere in there. And it's outside of Minerva. There's a history of sightings in that general area. There was like a daytime sighting in December of 2017 that happened right down the road, and just there were sightings in the area. And Heather is into, I guess you call it gifting, which is not something I'm super into, but like, she's interested in that stuff. So she's always like done things like place rocks in the woods and toys and things like that. And there have been things that have happened out there with that stuff that kind of defies logic. Like, there was probably, my favorite is, there was this one yellow crystal or something she kept putting out. And one of the times it got taken, it would get taken and then reappear weeks later or something. But this one time she had put it out and it was taken, and it was gone for like 2 months. And one day she came. Okay, so I told this wrong. So the crystal was taken, and then it was replaced with a squirrel skull. So there's a squirrel skull in its place, and then 2 months pass, and the rock shows back up in the same spot. So that was one of the weirder things. And I decided I was going to go out there and film some. But first, we had Alex and Eli out, and Alexander Pedikov and Eli Watson made an episode of Beyond the Trail there. And they had some stuff that happened. Nothing crazy. There was one night where they were staying in a chunk of the woods called the Rougarou Woods, which we've since come to, we call it the Rougarou Woods, by the way. I don't know if this is ever explained on the show, but we call it the Rougarou Woods because we filmed one of the key recreations in those woods. We filmed a recreation for Skinwalker Howl, the Rougarou, in those woods. So we call it the Rougarou Woods. But that's come to be a place that we now connect with, like tree knocking. There's like almost constant tree knocking from up there. I'll get to that later. So their weekend was fairly uneventful, but there were some interesting things happen. The biggest thing that happened to me that weekend was I had my son with me, and we were staying in a little cabin on the property that sits by a pond. My son's 4 years old, was 4 years old at the time, and him and I were asleep in the cabin. It was about 2 o'clock in the morning, and the rest of the group were still up. Alex was apparently, I didn't know this at the time, but was up in a tree stand, which was surrounded by a pack of coyote. And who else was out there? Heather, Andy, and Eli were off on a completely other side of the property, therming. They had a thermal imager, and they were out, trying to get footage of something. And Tommy and I were asleep because my kid's 4 years old and he goes to bed at 10 o'clock. So we're sound asleep. 2 o'clock in the morning. I woke up startled by the loudest tree knock I've ever heard. It sounded like a thunder crash outside the window. And I laid there for a second, and then I got really pissed off because I couldn't, I was stunned that Alex and them were doing tree knocks when my kid was asleep in the cabin, and they were right there. A couple of minutes passed, and finally, I thought it was weird. I wasn't hearing any movement or anything outside. So I get out of bed and I walk outside, and there's no one out there. And I mean, it's still as can be. So I get on the walkie, and I was like, "Are you guys?" Or no, actually, we didn't even have walkies then. I texted. I said, "Where is everybody?" And they told me then where they were. Alex is like, "I'm up in a tree stand surrounded by coyote. I can't really get down." And the others were like, "Oh, we're a mile away." I'm like, "Okay, well." So that was one of the weirder things that happened that weekend. But then we decided we were going to make the series called the Bigfoot Project. And the original idea behind it was going to be basically a podcast. We were going to shoot, we were going to take friends, various researchers, and maybe some locals out there. And we would do a little bit of like night investigation stuff, but it would mostly be us talking to those people in the woods and then with like a night investigation component. And our first night out there wasn't even supposed to be a filming night. It was Heather and I were out there, and we both had all our kids. So I had Tommy, and she had her 3 kids, and we're all hanging out. We had pizza. The kids had all gone up into the cabin, and we're watching TV or something. Not TV. We don't have there's no electricity out there or anything, and your Wi-Fi is actually really bad, or not Wi-Fi, but there's no signal really. So the kids were in the cabin doing something. They were maybe watching something on their iPad, but we're down by the fire, and we had been throughout the night hearing what we thought might have been tree knocks occasionally, and it turned out they were we started hearing footfalls, like running and stuff in the woods around us. And so I walked off down the trail. I mean, long story short, because I don't want to go through the whole thing, and it'd be really easy to just go watch the episode. But long story short, Heather and I ended up walking off down this trail, and then what seemed to be multiple subjects came in, kind of surrounded us in the woods, and were totally cool with us knowing they were there, which was really bizarre. And the most common, especially when it came out, the most common rebuttal to all of this is that, well, either were people in the woods. And I mean, we're in rural farmland Ohio. We all have guns. Like, everybody's got a gun. So you're on private property, you're going to get shot. Like, if that's your plan. So that was the night before. And it went on. Like, there was a lot of weird stuff that happened that night. There were tree knocks. There were a rock impact. Something threw a rock off a hill near us and landed right by us in the woods. Probably the freakiest kind of weird thing that happened that night was that this guy, Corey, one of our crew, was up by the house with the kids. And he was staying there because the kids were in the house, and Heather and I are on this trail, and we heard him screaming. And this is at like a key moment. Like, there was stuff going on all around us. We hear him start yelling. So, sorry. We're like trying to find out what's wrong. We're yelling back, "What's wrong?" And we came to find out basically what happened was he was on the front porch, and there's a window right in the bedroom where the cot is that you sleep on in the cabin. That's where all the kids were. They were all sitting on the cot. He heard something walk up behind the house on 2 feet, like crunch, 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 to that window. And so he was yelling to let it know he was there as he ran down off the porch and ran around back. So that was one of the weirder things that happened that night. The next day, the rest of the night, kind of like once the activity kind of died down, we were exhausted, for one thing, because I wasn't expecting any of that to happen. The next day, we were going out to place trail cams around the property, and we were on their Gator. They're like 4x4. and we were crossing a pipeline, and I was sitting in the front passenger seat, and then Corey was driving, and then Courtney was in the back filming. She was filming us. I was kind of like filming around as we went by, but we crossed this pipeline. I just glance up the hill, and there's this like dark brown upright thing trucking across the clear cut. When I see clear cut, so okay, so when I see it, I don't know what to do with that information. So I scream stop, but as I scream stop, I've already leapt from the moving gator, which is doing about 20 miles an hour at that point. So I hit the ground, and I'm also on a pretty steep decline down toward the pipeline. So I'm already on a hill, and I hit the ground. I'm like running, and it's that like ridiculous thing where you're like flailing your arms trying not to fall forward. And I'm running down toward the pipeline, and it was gone. Like it was gone. I never shot it. We have footage of nothing. There's nothing in the footage that was shot, but Corey and I went back and kind of recreated it a couple times driving by, because my thing was, maybe I saw there was so much undergrowth. By the way, like the reason I couldn't run up to where I had seen it was there's so much like there's so many thorns, and like the brush was just probably 6 feet tall. I couldn't get up there, but I thought maybe what I had seen was like a fern, or like like when you're driving in front of something and it gives the illusion that something's moving. So we tried recreating it, ran back over the same path that we had come through on. We could follow the tire tracks and all that stuff. And there was nothing visually that could have been an upright creature. I've said before, I don't know why. The only thing my brain latched onto was the movement of the arm. The right arm was like swinging, like a runner, and I could see muscle, and that's like it. But it was, maybe less than a second that I saw this thing too. And it's so quick, and it ran into the trees. And now one thing is, once we were out, once we stopped and everyone got out, we were all standing there, and you could hear movement up in the woods. But we're in Ohio. The undergrowth in some of these areas is pretty crazy. So you couldn't see anything, but we heard movement after the fact. That night was dead as a doornail. Like nothing happened. We thought maybe something. Oh, you know what? There was one thing that happened that night that was kind of cool. Very early in the evening, it wasn't even dark yet. It was maybe like 8 o'clock. We heard, it sounded like an 800-pound sprinter coming down the dirt path that leads to the cabin. And it went on for like 30 seconds. And I remember Heather saying to me, "Are you hearing this?" And I was like, "Yeah, it's coming right toward us." And walking down off the porch and walking over there, you could still hear it coming the whole way. Then it just stopped. But that was the only thing that happened that night. That was the rest of the weekend was dead. I had that sighting, and then it was like they knew they'd been spotted or something. It's a weird incident, because it's like it knew we were there. There's no way it's dumb enough that it didn't know we were there. We're in a moving vehicle, that's loud. Those things are loud. So I don't quite get why that happened. I do know that the spot that it was running made a lot more sense the next week, because at that point in time, we thought that where I had seen it, it was literally trucking through undergrowth, which didn't make a ton of sense because it was going so fast. And then we found out the next week that that there's a path up there that connects the two farms. There's like an adjoining farm, and it connects the two farms. So where I saw it running was literally on that path. It was running right on that path. We found that the next week after they brush hogged all the clear cut the next weekend, the pipeline, and that's when we found out there was a path there. So that's my sighting. It's not very exciting.
Well, I think it's pretty exciting, because that's one of the things that I've asked myself over and over and over again with people that have like roadside crossings and things, right? If Sasquatch is this big, elusive creature that doesn't want to be seen by anybody. And yet it almost gets hit 5 or 6 times a year by a Prius on a highway. It just amazes me that, like you said, this you're on a side by side, and these things are loud, and then here's this thing that obviously knows you're there, and then it
Yeah.
just sort of shows itself to you. It's just
Yeah.
fascinating to me, man. It's absolutely crazy, some of the sightings that I've talked to people that just don't make any sense, right? But we are talking about something that's not supposed to exist. So I wanted to ask you this: outside of the experience that you've had, obviously with the rock throwing and the tree knocking and some of the other things you guys have experienced while you're out filming, and obviously your sighting, have you had other weird experiences where you've seen things that you can't explain, whether it's on camera or off camera, that sort of made you think, maybe this is possible, that this may be what we're witnessing?
Just Bigfoot stuff. Like there's nothing. I've never had anything I would consider paranormal. Not that springs to mind. I mean, we've made like 25 movies. I can't even. um, the stuff that went on in Area X was game changing for me. You know, I always say it went from like 30% that these things were real to 80 while I was in there. But I you know, like I saw eye shine that weekend. We had a rock throw in the middle of the night and a whoop that I still replay in my head a lot. But nothing, you know, when it comes to like paranormal stuff, nothing. We actually made like a ghost hunting series that turned into us just never having anything happen. It was more about us like goofing off than it was about ghost hunting. And when it comes to UFOs, I fully believe UFOs are real. I don't know what they are, but fully believe they're real. But I haven't had my own experience with that. Dogman, I haven't had my own experience with that. So, yeah, all my stuff is like with Bigfoot, and it's never like in Alaska. I didn't, you know, not to, spoiler alert, but like I didn't see Bigfoot in Alaska. But that's it. It's all Bigfoot.
Well, you kind of mentioned it earlier. Let's talk a little bit about what you guys have going on YouTube, and we'll sort of end by summarizing what is coming up from Small Town Monsters here in the future. But talk a little bit about some of the projects you have going on YouTube and what people will find over on your YouTube channel.
Yeah, YouTube. So actually, this Sunday, episode 2 of The Ridge comes out. Sasquatch Unearthed The Ridge. That series is supposed to be like really in-depth deep dives into various Bigfoot topics. It's more of like a researcher show, I think, than anything. It's supposed to kind of follow research in specific geographic areas around the country. And like, spoiler alert, but if it works out, I would really love to do a whole season about the Olympic Peninsula. I also want to do one about the Adirondacks because that's like my favorite place on earth. But the episode 2 actually comes out on Sunday. We've got Beyond the Trail, which is Alexander Pedikov and Eli Watson. They kind of like travel all around the country, go to various like Bigfoot locations, and live off the land and do things I would never want to do. And I do know, okay, so this is a big spoiler for that because I don't think this has been said, but there's 2 episodes still coming out this year that'll tie into The Last Frontier, which is our On the Trail of Bigfoot Alaska movie. It's not an island, but the way you have to get there essentially makes it an island that they were on for like 7 days. I think they were at this place, and they did have activity, and like they actually found like a really cool piece of evidence that'll be highlighted in one of the episodes coming out this year. And I think they're planning a return trip to Alaska before the end of the year still. So that's Beyond the Trail. And then Bigfoot Project is in between seasons right now. And hopefully that launches again later this fall. And the plan is to do 6 to 8 episodes. Probably going to end up being 6 just because of time. But that's going to change a little bit. I'm still going to be going out to the cabin, but Cliff Barrickman and I had some interesting stuff happen at a place called Leesville Lake, where we captured a scream in the middle of the day. And so I'm probably going to start going there. I also want to start going to Salt Fork just because it's part of the whole Sasquatch Triangle thing. And I grew up in that part of Ohio. Like, it's funny, I get accused of being like a city boy, but I grew up in the sticks, and that's kind of where I feel most at home anymore. And so I'll probably be spending a lot of time camping in the areas that I grew up. And so the Bigfoot project will pivot a little bit. There is other stuff coming to the YouTube channel. I know Eli has a project he wants to work on kind of on his own. And then Alex as well has something coming later this year on his own as well. And then we do podcasts, which are currently on hiatus just because of the move to the new studio. So the YouTube's jumping, and the foreseeable future, it should just keep growing.
And you talked a little bit about the movies that we can expect for the rest of this year and into 2023, but just if you wouldn't mind recapping what you guys have coming out this year and what we can expect next year.
Yes, so we just put out American Werewolves, and then next up is Jersey Devil, our Jersey Devil movie. It's called Bloodlines: The Jersey Devil Curse. It's called that despite the fact it probably shouldn't be, so don't fault us for titles. But I'm excited for people to see that. I think it is the first movie we've made that I can say is a real dissection of a legend. You know, don't come to this movie looking for evidence of the Jersey Devil's existence, because it's not about that. It's very much about dissecting how the legend began and what, if anything, is behind it. And if, you know, like I'm really excited for people to see it, just because I think it's a really interesting history lesson in the birth of that story and how that story came to be and how that story kind of ties into the birth of our nation, which a lot of people don't realize, but some really cool stuff there. Last Frontier comes out in November or December, and that's on the trail of Bigfoot. And then there's a second part to The Last Frontier that'll come out next year, which is kind of like a surprise for people. But that is going to be a very dark look at the weirder side of Alaskan Bigfoot history, you know, specifically like missing people and some of the stranger stuff that goes on in connection with Bigfoot stories there, like strange lights and mountain giants and all kind of like weird stuff. That is actually going to premiere on June 2nd at the Canton Palace Theater in Canton, Ohio, as the opening night for our Monster Fest event that we're doing in Canton next year. So if anyone listening is from Ohio, we're doing an event in Canton, Ohio on June 3rd. We're going to have Cliff there. Cliff Barrickman will be there. Lyle Blackburn will be there. Those are the big, like, oh wait, Lauren Coleman. We haven't announced him yet. The Astonishing Legend guys will be there. Richard Haddam, who was the screenwriter of that Mothman Prophecies movie. Alex will be there. Oh, Justin Chernopesky. So if people are into like, Mountain Beast Mysteries on YouTube, there's just a lot of people. We're trying to create something really cool. It's like something I've wanted to do for years, and we're finally just investing in it and hopefully turning it into an annual thing.
Sounds awesome, man. I appreciate your time, Seth. Breedlove. I'll link to everything that we talked about in the show notes for everybody to go check it out. Go over to the YouTube page, subscribe, like, watch the stuff. It's awesome, awesome stuff. Seth, I can't thank you enough for your time and coming on the show, man. I've had a blast talking to you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely.